Well, welcome to Christ in Culture. This is Pastor Jeff Short, your Bible teacher for today. We're going to be talking about an issue that I see in a number of different churches, evangelical churches specifically, but actually churches all over the world and all over the United States especially. And we're going to be talking about churches dealing with non-issues as if they are issues. Churches dealing with topics that are not actual real issues, but they're dealing with them because the mainstream media and the institutional powers that be, the academics and the universities and the law field and all of these different institutions, they are talking about it as if it's a real issue. And so the church then, looking at the marketing figures and polling data and focus groups, they say, hey, we have to talk about this issue as if it's a real issue because people are thinking it's a real issue. And what is the issue that I'm talking about? Racial reconciliation. Yes, racial reconciliation. This issue is being pushed at us every single day. We're constantly confronted with, the problem, the crisis in our society of white supremacy, the crisis in our society of systemic racism, the crisis in our society of white privilege. Oh, this is such a crisis. We have to deal with this. And it's coming to a head. And last year we saw rioting in the streets and burning down city blocks and murders and killing people and people coming up to police cars and shooting policemen in the head. All because what? What's the problem? Racial reconciliation. And so I was recently watching a large megachurch, and the topic of the sermon, this is a predominantly white church, and the pastor was on vacation, and there was a black minister who was the guest speaker. And guess what his topic was? Can you guess? Is there any idea in your head that what he might have been talking about? You guessed it, racial reconciliation. That was his topic. And he had been brought in to address this very important topic of racial reconciliation and address it seriously so that Christians can understand that they shouldn't discriminate and they shouldn't be prejudiced and they shouldn't hate their black brothers and sisters, and on and on and on and on. And I'm thinking in my head, no, wait a minute. Was there a problem? Has there been some incident at this church? Has there been some local situation where there was some gross example of racism or gross example of white supremacy or gross example of some white privilege? Or what is the crisis that has to be addressed? In other words, there is the actions and behaviors of this church. They're acting like there is some urgent need to address the Christian white population, of the urgent need to not be racist. And I'm scratching my head and I say, wait a minute. As far as I can see, and as far as I can tell from the available evidence and the data and the statistics, actual reality reflects that the current state of our culture right now is that racism is virtually non-existent, that people don't hate people based on the color of their skin. That's what racism is. As far as I can tell, in our culture right now, among white people don't hate black people. White people don't hate Asian people. We've heard in the mainstream media, the report, the narrative is that there's been a spike in Asian hate crimes in our culture. Oh, there's a crisis now. We have another crisis. Not only is there rampant racism and white supremacy, well, now there's a crisis, and that is Asian hate crimes. There is animus against Asian people. And I'm looking around and I'm looking at evidence and statistics and I'm saying, where is the crisis? Where is the crisis? Because all I see is people going to work, going to school, going shopping, recreating, going to entertaining, living their lives, trying to get along with their neighbors as best as possible. I don't see this issue, this so-called racist issue, as a real live issue. And so my question is, if there's no statistical evidence for this so-called racist crisis in our country, and there isn't, if there's no anecdotal evidence that there's a crisis of racism in our country, why do we as churches and as pastors feel that we have to address a non-real issue? Why do we feel that we have to address an issue that's not real and actually happening in our world, when there are so many other real issues that need to be addressed in the church on Sunday morning? There's so many biblical issues that have to be addressed on Sunday morning, and the church has to speak prophetically to. Why are we wasting our time and wasting thousands of people's Sunday morning hour talking about something that's not real? And in the United States today, in the year 2021, I can tell you, statistically speaking, and from my own experience, that white people don't hate black people. White people don't hate Asian people. There is not this divide that we're being told that exists by the mainstream media, by the BLM activists, by Antifa, by all these agitating activist groups. They're trying to convince us that this country is a racist, white supremacist land, and there is no evidence for that. And so what I have to say to the churches and pastors in this country is stop talking about boogeyman issues. Stop talking about fake news issues. Get your agenda from the Bible, get your agenda from reality, and stop following the mainstream crowd. And that's what's happening in our churches today. We have pastors who are looking at the marketing information, and they're looking at the mainstream media news hype about all kinds of issues. And they're saying, well, if the reporters on CBS and ABC and NBC and CNN and MSNBC and NPR and the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post, if all of those reporters are saying that we have a crisis of racism in this country, well, we must have it. And so we have to address this vital issue. And so we have to call in our African-American pastor brothers to talk to the predominantly white congregations about the crisis of racism that we face in our country. No, you don't. In fact, if you do that, you are being unfaithful to God's word, because the crisis that you're addressing doesn't exist. Now, it did exist in this country 150 years ago. There is no doubt about it. When you look at the Southern slavery situation, there is definitely a cause for talking about racism and trying to convince people that, according to the Bible, all men are created equal, that they're made in the image of God, and that we need to treat people fairly and justly and not judge them on the basis of the color of their skin. Okay, 150 years ago or 100 years ago, that was the case. But today, it is not the case. Now, if you wanted to say, well, that's right, the Civil War stopped over slavery, but then there was still this racial prejudice and discrimination that was still happening in the United States, especially in the South, for years and years and decades after the Civil War, because just by winning a Civil War, you don't change automatically the hearts and minds of people who are racist and who are prejudiced and who have had racial hatred in their hearts and white supremacy and that kind of. You don't change that overnight just because of the results of the Civil War. And that's true. And so along came the 60s civil rights legislation, And over 50 years ago, the effects of stamping out overt, public, legal, systemic racism in the law was that over time people have began to see that, hey, this is something that we need to eliminate from our society. We need to stop treating people based on the color of their skin. And so we've aligned our legal laws in every state. It is illegal to discriminate on the basis of skin color and of race and all kinds of other things, religion, ethnic background, all kinds of things. And here we are in the 21st century. And if you look at the typical person, the vast majority of the United States, this is not an issue. This is not an issue. If you look at what is actually taking place in our communities every day, day in, day out, you have a population of people who get the message, hey, racism is wrong, prejudice is wrong, judging a person on the color of their skin is wrong, and people don't do it, by and large don't do it. Now, are there individual isolated cases of people expressing racist thoughts or racist comments or racist speech or racist behavior? Are there individual isolated instances of that occurring in the United States even after all of the progress that has been made over the last 150 years? Yes, there are isolated instances, but that doesn't mean that there is a crisis of racism in this country, because if you actually look at the evidence for it, it's very slim, very slim. In fact, we're at the point now where the Black Lives Matter activists and the so-called social justice activists have to come up with fake news, race hoaxes to try to stay in the news. We saw last year the Jussie Smollett, a young actor, African-American actor, who faked a race hate crime. He faked it. He set it up. He planned it out. He reported to the police. So this is a very serious crime. He tried to stage a fake race hate crime to show people today that hate crime is real and racism is real. And so in order to go to the point of proving his point, he had to fake the hate crime. We also saw the instance last year of the NASCAR driver Bubba Wallace, an African-American race car driver, who reported to the FBI a hate crime because when he walked into a car repair bay stall at one of the NASCAR arenas, there was a rope hanging, and he took it as a noose. And he took it as a sign of racism. He took it as a sign of white supremacy. And so he called the FBI. They sent 10 or more agents to investigate it. And at the end of their investigation, they concluded it was just a rope to pull the door down once it had been sprung up. And it's nothing at all related to race, nothing at all related to white supremacy. There was no hate crime that was done. It was simply a false report. It was not at all what the person thought it was. And it was interpreted as a hate crime when it was simply an innocent rope sitting there doing its job. So this is where we've come to. We have this so-called crisis of race in our country, and we have riots in the streets over so-called race hate crimes. We have people burning down businesses and burning down city blocks and committing acts of violence and even murder over the so-called injustice of racism. When it comes right down to it, you would be hard-pressed to actually find a case of racism in our culture today in the 21st century, 2021. And yet we have churches who are spending their time, I would say wasting their time, talking to their congregation and saying, you shouldn't be racist, you shouldn't have racial hatred in your heart, when nobody does. When nobody actually, at this point in the history of our country, actually does. And those individuals that you actually see that are racist, you can probably count them on one hand. And if you ask yourself the question, have you actually ever talked to a pure racist who really looks at a person's skin color and judges them based on that, and who actually has racial hatred? You would be hard-pressed to actually come up with a living example. Now, there are always examples from the past, and you can go back into history and you can actually find quotes and you can find behaviors. You look back at the Ku Klux Klan and you can see the terrible crimes that they committed. No question, that's racial hatred motivated. No question. But we're not there right now. Okay, so as church leaders and pastors, we have to address church issues that are real and lively and are actually relevant, not fake hoax crimes that the mainstream media and the leftist activists want to push out in society for their own political ends. We know that these cultural Marxists, as they're called, or social Marxists, they are wanting to bring about fundamental change in our society. They have a leftist liberal agenda, actually moving toward a socialist agenda. In many cases, outright socialist agenda. We have congresswomen who are actually outright socialist. And part of the methodology that they use to promote their political agenda is to divide society. And one of the best ways to divide society is to try to do so along the lines of race and ethnicity. And so if you can get white people and black people fighting and dividing, if you can get Asians and black people fighting, if you can get this group, racial group, and that racial group dividing and fighting, then the chaos that that causes can be a situation where these social, cultural Marxists come in and push their political agenda. And so we've seen that happen. And they're using it as a tool of social change. So Karl Marx's famous philosophy was that you divide society along class lines. You have the upper class and the lower class, and you get the upper and the lower class fighting with each other, and eventually there is chaos, and in the midst of that chaos, a better society can come about. Well, in our society, because of the blessings of God and because of innovation and because of prosperity that we've experienced here in the West, there isn't that class hatred like there was, say, in the 1800s in England. And so you don't have the middle class so discontent because they're actually enjoying life for the first time. They actually have the ability to buy a home, buy a car, have a living wage, and so forth. And so there's not that class tension that can foment revolution. So now the Marxists have changed gears, and now it's not class warfare, but it's race warfare that they're trying to instigate and bring about social change. And so they're trying to convince people that the United States is systemically racist, that it's just a terrible white supremacy camp, that people are hating people of different color, and there's a lot of animosity, racial tension, and all that. The fact is that is not true. And it's not true in evangelical churches. It's not true in evangelical colleges. My old alma mater now is acting as if this whole issue of race is so vitally, critically important that they have hired a specialist to come in, and the position of multicultural engagement. So we have to have someone on the campus of Wheaton College that monitors racial tensions and make sure that there are no racial animosities taking place, and trying to do everything that we can to keep the races from fighting, which is totally a false position. This position does not need to exist. There is not a race war taking place on Christian college campuses, and there's no racial animosity taking place in Christian churches across the country. There is the general level of sin in our churches. There is the general level of sin in our Christian colleges and in our Christian institutions, and there's nothing that can be done to totally eliminate that except preach the Word of God. We have to keep preaching the Word of God and addressing sins of all types. And so it is proper and right for pastors in their normal pulpit preaching schedules to preach about, at some point, reconciliation in respect to races and ethnicities and the classes that exist in society and all the differences that human beings have with one another. It's proper and right for pastors to talk about those differences and say we need to love one another, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, love your neighbor as yourself. You know, in the context of normal preaching, it will come up from time to time because the Bible addresses all of the issues of life. The Bible is totally relevant to all of the issues of life. And if you're a normal pastor, you may preach on the topic of reconciliation, not just racial, but again, like I said, ethnic rivalries and ethnic differences, cultural differences, all these issues. You will address those from time to time because the Bible talks about them in passages from time to time. But to come at the race issue specifically and say, okay, we have a major crisis on our hands right now that has to be addressed right now immediately because of the severity of the problem, that is a false evaluation of reality. It is. So pastors who spend their time worrying about addressing racial tensions and racial reconciliation at this time are chasing a false news agenda. It's just as simple as that. And the only reason they're doing it is because they say, well, people think it's a real issue because the mainstream media is talking about it all the time. It's a topic of conversation in universities and colleges, and it's really big in universities and colleges. And now a lot of corporations are jumping on the so-called woke bandwagon. And so it's a topic at university and colleges and businesses and corporations and the HR departments. And so it's being talked about as if it's something huge and big and major and is a crisis. So a lot of pastors say, well, I guess I better talk about it because everybody's talking about it, and I got to talk about it as if it's a serious issue because everybody else is, I guess, seeing it as a serious issue. Instead of stepping back and going, well, wait a minute, what is the issue? Is the issue that white people are treating black people as subhuman? Oh, that's not a reality. The reality is people in this country right now are treating people of different and diverse backgrounds, ethnic, racial, religious, cultural differences. They're probably at no other time have we gotten to the point where we do accept all of those differences in a more mature manner than we ever have. So, in fact, in opposition to what the mainstream media is reporting, in opposition to what the Black Lives Matter activists are trying to tell us, we are, as a people in this country, probably more tolerant of differences in people, say, at work that we have to work with, or in the colleges and universities where we study, or in the organizations that we're a part of, in government. There's probably been no time in the history of our country where people have been more tolerant and more loving in the sense of being willing to put up with the differences of other people in government than right now. In fact, because of the laws that have been passed over the years, if someone were to try to even hint at being racist, they would probably lose their government job right away. No questions asked. Just you're a racist, boom. In fact, they may even be set up to lose their job because of a fake hoax race hate incident, like the Jussie Smollett or the Bubba Wallace thing. So, quite the contrary. The people in this country right now are probably more tolerant of differences in people than at any other time. And so, what is the reason why churches have to spend, I know one pastor spent 4 weeks last year during the riots taking place. We were told by the news reporters that we have a crisis of racism in our country. We were told by the news reporters and the mainstream media that George Floyd died at the hands of a racist. There's no evidence that he died at the hands of a racist. Derek Chauvin was not convicted of racism. He was not convicted of a hate crime. His crime, if it's a crime, was that he committed an act of police brutality or excessive force or some other category, but there is no incidence, there's no evidence in his trial that this man was a racist. There's no evidence that he wouldn't have done that to anyone of any race. People who throw their weight around, you might say bullies, that's a separate incident and issue than race. So you can be a bully without being a racist. You can throw your weight around without having racial animosity in your heart. And so when people point to George Floyd incident, see, that's racism. See, that's an example. Show me the proof of racism. I know that there's proof of violence and there's some kind of a crime was committed, but there's no evidence in the record that it was due to racial animosity on the part of the policeman toward the perpetrator. No, there's no evidence of that. So this fake news, hate, race crime that we're being told is rampant in our country is actually non-existent. And so as church leaders and pastors, we have to be careful that we don't buy in and repeat the lies that we're being told in society. Don't preach sermons on racial reconciliation when there isn't an issue that needs to be addressed. Like I said before, there are all kinds of sins out there in our country right now. Materialism, sexual immorality, rebellion against God, hatred toward the things of God. There's all kinds of sins, and our country is paying for those sins, by the way. And God is bringing about that judgment. But don't give people a false guilt. Don't try to falsely shame people for sin when they're not committing the sin. And I would say that churches need to stop perpetuating this false narrative that they're being told by the mainstream media. Let's just preach the word and preach the Bible and stop meddling into politics. Well, hope that's been helpful. We'll see you back next week on another edition of Christ and Culture. God bless.